Hello and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into Hollow Knight, the game that everyone says is so good. Does that mean it's overrated, potentially? Because if everyone says a game is really good, it has the potential to be, well, just overhyped, as they say. And I'm going to be looking into if that is the case. Now, this is coming from someone who's played the game for 100 hours about. So I think I know what I'm talking about. I've basically beaten the entire game. Just missing a couple things, but I basically know the ins and outs of this game, so I have the right to kind of speak on it. I feel like this is not coming from someone who's just played the game once and said, "Oh, yeah, this is fine." Like, no, there's more to it. Now, let's just get started. So the first thing we're gonna have to look at is progression, because progression in any game is probably the most important detail. The reason why I say that is because of the fact that progression is the way you tell that you're making progress towards becoming, I would like to say, the god. You know, you feel like you're so OP and overpowered, and you're the god of the game, right? And Hollow Knight does it pretty well, but there's some issues. Now, the first issue will be early game. Now, this is probably due to the fact that they don't really give you much movement. Now, progression in this game is based off of basically what a I forgot the word. Mediterranean? No, God. A metaverse? No. Oh, no, wait. Metrovania. Yeah. I didn't have to search that up. Nope, no. I didn't have to search that up. Alright, it's a Metrovania, which basically means that there's going to be a lot of exploring, and you have to find abilities to be able to basically backtrack and find new areas of areas you already explored, if that makes sense. So, of course, they're going to start you out with basically nothing, but I think the problem with that is that the game is very slow paced in the beginning, because you really can't do much besides just attack. That's about it, and jump and move. And there's not even really a sprint button. And not only that, but then of course you have the basic ass enemies that appear, which are very easy to kill, and it's really bland experience until I'd say you get to the Mantis Claw, because once you get to the Mantis Claw, you have movement, and you also now can kind of make your own decisions. One of the issues with the progression system in the early game is that it kind of forces you to follow a path. There's really not many other options. So when you replay the game, or even the first time you play the game, it's kind of like, feels like, okay, this is a linear game. But that's not the truth at all about this game. The reality is that you can choose where you want to go after you get the Mantis Claw and play the game however you deem is necessary, and experience the game in different ways compared to other people. Now, that's why I think the very first hour or two of the game is very bland, and once you get past that and progress with new items, yeah. And that's why I think people have a hard time playing the game when they first start, because at least for me, I stopped playing in the first hour or two of playing the game because I found it very bland and boring. Did not realize that it was going to get better, and I was like one step away from literally making the game better, but I didn't realize it at the time. But otherwise, it's a pretty solid progression system. Basically, how it works is you have to find certain bosses, or sometimes even specific rooms, and usually you'll find an item, and that item will allow you to basically not only fight bosses easier because you have a new way to dash. For example, you have the Shade Cloak, which allows you to, dash through enemies, which is pretty nice. But you also have the ability to explore new areas. Like, again, the Shade Cloak, you can dash through these, like, laser things or black void things, barriers, basically. And the only way to get through them is just the Shade Cloak dash, right? And so it means that as you find these items, not only are you able to explore more of the map, but you're also able to fight bosses easier and have more moves and more different ways to dodge attacks and attack, which I think is why the early game feels so bland, because you don't really have many variety in the ways you can attack. It's just walking around and jumping around. That's it. And it gets really bland. And I think the progression system is genius because of the fact that each upgrade is essential, and you can find them at basically any point. I mean, you don't really need all the upgrades in the game at any point because of the fact that the bosses are all designed relatively to be easy in the sense that you're not supposed to have every upgrade, because there's really no path to success. Which you couldn't make the arguments bad because some of the bosses are a little too easy for some people. I mean, for example, if you got the Shade Cloak before you were able to kill, before you defeated the Watcher Knights and make the Watcher Knights like 10 times easier, right? But it's still like the bosses are relatively challenging, which we'll get into in a bit. So overall, progression is pretty satisfying, in my opinion at least, because at the end of the progression system, and in fact every time you get a new item, it just feels like you actually are more of a god, and at the end you feel like a god. And not only that, but we also have to go over the fact of, charms. We'll talk them more about in depth in a second, but they really help make you feel like a god because suddenly you can, just become overpowered in many different aspects and become so much stronger than you were before. And not only that, but you also have the nail upgrades, which are just so good. People say, oh, but they're not that good because bosses have more health. Yeah, but you do more damage, so overall it's actually an upgrade. I don't know why people have this misconception. And now, I also want to mention Geo. It's one of those things that's really important to progressing because a lot of the charms and just keys to explore and whatnot involves Geo. And I do feel like Geo in the early game especially is a little bit really hard to get, if that makes sense. It's really obnoxious to get. And as you get farther and farther the game, it becomes easier and easier. And then you just don't need it suddenly. And the problem with that is it results in basically you struggling to get the money, and once you can get the money easily, you don't need it. So it just feels kind of weird, and most of the items you need with Geo, by the way, are kind of pointless. I'm just going to say it, most of the charms are kind of not great that you can buy with Geo. Obviously, there's OP things you can buy with Geo, though. I'm not saying it's useless. And while we're on that topic, Master Shards and Vessel Shards are very cool. I like it. You basically have to explore for most of them and find them through hidden ways, and the only way you can access most of them is through progressing by getting specific things like the Mantis Claw. And it's pretty nice. I have to say, it's a pretty nice system, and it's very satisfying to find them because they could be in really weird places and you tend to forget about them and you just run across them and you're like, oh, I can actually do this now. It makes you realize, wow, I actually progressed in the game and have become more stronger than I was last time I was here. Now we have the charms. Now the charms are a big point of progression. I already talked about that, but we gotta go more in depth into the charms. Now the charms are very, very important, obviously, because without them you would be pretty weak and pretty fragile and just all that stuff, right? And I feel like each charm has its uses. One of the downsides is, though, is that they all have uses, but some of them are just not great. There's a lot of good options and a lot of synergies and a lot of different ways to play the game, but there's some that are just downright kind of just horrible. An example of this is the fungal charm or something, the spore charm, which basically releases spores every time you try to heal. And it's like, why would you ever use this? I don't know. And there's a couple more of those where it's just kind of like feels a little bit like useless because why would you ever use these? Another one is basically any summon ones. Now I know people are going to say, oh, but summons make it so you don't have to try as hard in fights. Yeah, but you could just replace those with things that can make your character stronger and you'd probably do more damage and have a better time in boss fights or just in general. So it's like, I don't know why they're in the game because they don't really do much damage and just kind of take up space. And speaking of space, the charm notch system is perfect. When you have the max charm notches, it feels balanced. Like it's like if there was one more, you would have so much charms you could use that are just too OP, and it's a good system because it means you can use a good amount of charms, but you can't use enough OP charms. It's like you barely can it's like one away from being able to be broken, and it's good that they made it that way. I think that's great. And now we're going to talk about the map. Now the map is just amazing, I have to say. A lot of people will make the argument that the map can be complicated and confusing, and that's because of a brilliant system, in my opinion, which is the system of finding this guy who basically gives you a map of the area, and then it's not filled out, and you have to fill out the rest. Which means whenever you go to a new area, you're probably not going to know where you are. You're not going to know where most things are, and you're going to have to explore it for yourself. And people will say, "Oh, but that's so hard. I'm going to get lost. What if I don't find the map guy? Oh my God, I'm going to get lost." Yes, there's times where you're lost, but there's always multiple ways out, and you're bound to find one. I don't know how people can really say they're going to get lost necessarily unless they literally don't map any of the areas. The other thing about the map system that I really do think is brilliant, by the way, is the fact that you have to sit in a bench to fill out your map. Why do I say that's brilliant? Because, well, it results in you basically exploring and not being able to still see where you are until you actually go to somewhere you know is a bench and then sit there, if that makes sense. And so basically, it's it just means that it's not as easy to just walk into a new area and be like, oh, I know exactly where I'm going. You still are going to have some struggle. And the thing about the map that's really genius is each area has its own unique theme, and you can kind of tell each area apart. But not only that, but I think the most important part of the map is that there's multiple ways to get in most areas. Most, not all. I mean, actually, I don't think there's a single area that has only one way to get in. Every single area has multiple connections to different areas, which means that if you're in, the bottom half of the map, it's still easy to get to the top and go to the top right? It's not that hard compared to if there's one way into each place. Also, the fast travel system is pretty nice because it doesn't really just make it like, oh, I can fast travel everywhere I go, don't have to worry about exploring ever again. It's kind of, you still have to walk, but it's not that much walking. And so it does make it so that you don't spend a lot of time walking, which is one of the things that early game kind of sucks, is you do a lot of walking when you first explore areas, and it can be very tedious. So, I also want to mention benches, which are, I think, mostly strategically placed in areas where you can basically be safe and be somewhat close to where you want to be too, as well, which is nice. And it's basically a healing ground and a place to, change your charms, which is pretty nice. The only complaint I have with benches is some of them are placed very far from the bosses. I'm coughing at the Night Watchers. The benches can sometimes be a little bit far, but it doesn't really matter because, well, I mean, it's not that big of a deal. It just can be inconvenient, is all. I mean, yeah. The bosses. The bosses of Hollow Knight are, well, in my opinion, not too difficult, but they're difficult. And I know that sounds weird, but on a first playthrough, you're going to struggle to most of the bosses because, well, first off, you're getting used to the movement, and also, I think the most important thing is you don't know the bosses. And once you understand the bosses, you'll realize that most of them are relatively simple, using only a couple different attack patterns, usually like 4 or 5 max, with not much going on otherwise besides those attack patterns, which means once you understand that, you basically win the fight. It's especially on the hard bosses, the understanding how to dodge and when to attack and when to heal that becomes the issue with boss fights. You have to learn when to heal, which also I want to mention, healing is genius, because basically, unlike any other game, you basically have to find time to heal, and it's not as simple as, oh, I knocked the guy on the ground and now I can heal for a bit. Yes, most bosses have that ability where you stun them for a bit or whatnot, but you also have to find time to heal sometimes in the middle of the fight, and you have to know what attack pattern gives you the right time to heal. It's very interesting, and overall, I think the bosses, almost all of them, are well done, and they're good for the stage you're at. I mean, yes, like I said earlier, some of the bosses, especially in the later game, feel a little bit easier because you're not supposed to have all the OP gear that you do. That's because you have the choice to go however you want to play the game once you get the Mantis Claw, which means you literally could just go and straight fight up the Watcher Knights and win that in the beginning, or you could fight it near the end of the game when you have all this OP gear, which means they can't be too hard, otherwise I mean, you would be screwed. And that's just one example. I do think the bosses that shine out the most are the ones that the game knows that you're going to have all this OP gear and can actually make it difficult. Nightmare King Grim and Pure Vessel are... or I think it's called the Pure Vessel? I don't remember. Those two bosses are very, let's just say, well done because they know that you're going to have the most OP gear at this point, all the charms. So that means that they can go all out, and the attacks are way harder and a lot more fun to dodge and a lot more satisfying to overcome. I spent way more hours on these two bosses alone than any other boss. Now we're going to go into the soundtrack, or better known as the audio. Now, I'm gonna say it, the soundtrack is pretty great. I mean, if you put this, I mean, all I have to say is the soundtrack is great. I don't even have words for how great it is. It's stupidly great. It has a great exploration vibe and just a very adventurous feel to it. And each volume basically has their own soundtrack, and it results in some really... It just adds on to the experience of each specific place. Not only that, but you also have to realize that the audio, as in, like, you know, the sounds of enemies, are very, I don't know, I feel like I want to say iconic. When I first heard, you know, some of the enemies, it just sounded very interesting, and also the voice acting's pretty nice. Like, they all speak gibberish, which I think is pretty cool. But it sounds like they're actually saying something, but it's really just gibberish. I mean, it's pretty well done. And of course, we have probably what I'd say for last for a reason, the lore. Now, I'm not going to go in depth with the lore, but all I'm going to say is one of the things I like about the lore is you have to piece it together, which some people can argue is a bad thing, but I think it's good because it results in you missing things, but if you pay enough attention, you will eventually figure out what is going on and how this whole thing works. Although I do have to make a good point that it will be unlikely you'll understand everything on your first playthrough, and you'll probably be confused on what's happening, especially in the endings. You'll be thinking, what the hell is going on? But, you know, as time goes on and you start going more in-depth look into the game, you'll probably piece it together, which I like because one of the issues with games is that they do a lot of showing rather than telling. I mean, they do a lot of telling rather than showing, and telling is not always the most optimal way to, you know, show lore. I mean, obviously, because showing the lore is more effective because you actually have to play through it to find it and whatnot, you know, usually. Alright, and the last thing, I'm saving last for a reason, is endgame content. Now, endgame content basically is very interesting because it basically is anything that comes after you beat the final boss of the game, or one of the endings. That's what I define endgame content, because by then you probably have most of the things, you probably have most of the charms, and there's a lot of things to do, but the main thing I'm going to focus on is the Hall of Gods. I like this place because this is where you're going to spend most of your time, and it gives you something to do and test your abilities after having all these new upgrades, all these charms, all these powers, right? It gives you a challenge, and I'm going to say it, it's a little bit ridiculous. Pantheon 5 in particular, the final one, where you have to fight every single boss in the game, is outright ridiculous. Why? Well, the last boss of the entire Pantheon, which takes about 40-something minutes to get to, is a boss you will never be able to practice ever before that point, which I think is ridiculous. I just want to comment on it because Pantheon 5 is already ridiculous. All the other Pantheons, you know, they're reasonable, 10 minutes, 12 minutes, 15 minutes. Okay, yeah, sure, they add unique bosses you can't see anywhere else in the game. That's not really an issue. The issue is when you have a 40-minute plus Pantheon that's every single boss, and then you incorporate a new boss at the final boss. That is incredibly difficult, and some people consider the hardest boss. Well, that's a very flawed system, because it basically means that no matter what, you're going to have to replay the entire Pantheon once you get to the final part. And yes, you can practice it after you see it, but why? Why do that? Why can't you practice it before you see it? Like, it's so silly. I mean, everyone already knows that about the final boss of the Pantheon, so it's just like, you might as well put it in. I get that it's supposed to be a surprise, It's not even a surprise nowadays. I mean, literally everyone knows it. Anyways, is Hollow Knight overrated, underrated, or well rated? I think for the most part, it's well rated. The game is going to give you a lot of content. It's very satisfying to play and become more and more stronger as you go. Exploring the map can be very fun and interesting. Finding the secrets is very fun. If anything, it might be a little bit overrated, and the reason why I say that is because of the fact that there's a couple flaws, such as the fact that the beginning of the game is very, very annoying. But for the most part, I'd say it's well rated, and I would recommend anyone to play this game. I think it's one of the greatest games. Not the greatest game, but up there on my list of good games. And without that further ado, I'm gone. I don't know why I say that, but I mean, I'm done. Or I don't know how to do outro anymore. You know what? Yeah, outro. Boop, 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 boop. That okay? That was so pointless. All right, yeah. Peace.